William Wallace, one of Scotland's most legendary figures, was born around 1270 in Elderslie, a small village in Renfrewshire, Scotland. While precise details of his early life are somewhat shrouded in the mist of history, the fragments that survive suggest that he was born into a modest, noble family. His father, also named William Wallace, was a minor landowner with some local influence, but his family was far from the powerful Scottish nobility that dominated the political landscape of the time. Despite this, young Wallace grew up in a Scotland that was simmering with discontent, a land divided by feudal loyalties, threatened by foreign invasion, and bound by centuries of struggle against English dominance. From an early age, Wallace was exposed to the harsh realities of life under the shadow of English oppression. Scotland, though independent in name, was frequently subjected to English interference, particularly during the reign of King Edward I, whose ambitions to subjugate the Scots would eventually set the stage for Wallace's rebellion. It was a time when villages like Elderslie were forced to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining their Scottish identity and appeasing English overlords. Tales from his youth suggest that Wallace was a keen observer of these injustices. He witnessed firsthand the heavy taxation imposed on local farmers, the arbitrary enforcement of English law, and the humiliation suffered by Scottish nobles who dared to resist. As a child, Wallace likely learned the skills of a warrior not in formal academies or courts, but in the rugged landscapes of the Scottish countryside. The forests, hills, and rivers of Renfrewshire were not just playgrounds, they were training grounds. Boys of his social class were expected to be able to handle a sword, ride a horse, and survive in harsh conditions. Wallace's early years were probably marked by such practical education, preparing him physically and mentally for a life that would soon be dominated by conflict. His reputation for exceptional strength, intelligence, and resolve, recorded in later chronicles, may well have its roots in these formative experiences. Wallace's character was further shaped by the social and familial environment in which he grew up. Stories from the period suggest that he was fiercely independent and morally principled, traits that would later define his leadership. His upbringing emphasized loyalty, honor, and justice, values that were frequently tested under the pressures of feudal obligations and the encroaching power of the English crown. Unlike some of his contemporaries who sought personal gain through alliances with the English, Wallace displayed an early disdain for subservience and an instinctive empathy for the oppressed. Even as a young man, he was known to challenge unfair treatment of local peasants and assert his own sense of justice, sometimes placing himself at personal risk. The political climate of Scotland during Wallace's youth cannot be overstated. The death of King Alexander III in 1286 and the subsequent death of his heir, Margaret the Maid of Norway, in 1290, left Scotland in a perilous position. A succession crisis erupted, with multiple claimants vying for the throne, and the country became vulnerable to external manipulation. King Edward I of England saw an opportunity to exert control and demanded recognition as Scotland's overlord. Many Scottish nobles reluctantly complied, swearing fealty to Edward in exchange for protection or political advantage. This period of uncertainty and betrayal undoubtedly influenced Wallace's worldview. While other Scots negotiated for personal gain or survival, Wallace seems to have developed a deep-seated desire for true national independence, a vision that would later fuel his rebellion. Another critical influence on Wallace's early life was the culture of resistance that permeated certain Scottish communities. Even before Edward's formal campaigns, small-scale uprisings, local skirmishes, and acts of defiance against English officials were not uncommon. Wallace grew up hearing stories of legendary Scottish heroes and warriors who had resisted foreign domination, such as Robert the Bruce's forebears and the men who fought in previous border wars. These narratives of courage and sacrifice likely inspired Wallace and instilled in him a belief that one individual, if sufficiently determined, could challenge even the mightiest of oppressors. It was during these years that Wallace began to exhibit the qualities that would later make him a formidable leader. Chroniclers note his physical prowess, intelligence, and charisma, traits that allowed him to inspire loyalty among those around him. Even before he gained prominence, he demonstrated a keen understanding of strategy and human behavior. He was reportedly quick to identify injustice and slow to tolerate corruption, traits that would later define his leadership style. His early life, though relatively obscure compared to his later exploits, was thus a crucible in which his identity as a Scottish patriot and rebel was forged. An often cited anecdote from Wallace's youth, though steeped in legend, illustrates his emerging defiance. According to later accounts, as a young man, Wallace avenged the murder of a family member by killing English soldiers responsible for the act. This incident, whether entirely factual or embellished over time, symbolizes the early stirrings of his rebellion and foreshadows the more organized campaigns of resistance he would undertake in adulthood. It reflects both his personal courage and his refusal to submit to injustice, a defining feature of his character. Wallace's upbringing also emphasized the importance of community and collective action. Growing up in a rural Scottish village meant that life was intimately tied to the fortunes of neighbors, kin, and local leaders. Survival required cooperation, and decisions were often guided by a sense of fairness and shared responsibility. These early experiences likely contributed to Wallace's later ability to unite disparate Scottish factions under a common cause. He understood the power of solidarity and the necessity of building alliances, skills that would become critical when leading armies against the English. By the mid-1290s, as Wallace entered adulthood, Scotland's political situation had grown increasingly dire. Edward I had begun asserting more direct control, demanding military service and tribute, and punishing those who resisted. The Scottish people, especially the common folk, were growing restless and tensions were escalating. Wallace, now a young man in his 20s, was positioned to respond to these pressures. His early experiences, shaped by a sense of justice, exposure to oppression, and immersion in a culture of resistance, had prepared him for the role he was destined to play. The combination of personal courage, strategic insight, and moral conviction set the stage for his rise as the leader of a national rebellion. In conclusion, William Wallace's early life in Elderslie was a crucible of experience that forged his character and ideals. Born into a modest noble family during a period of political instability, he witnessed injustice, oppression, and the consequences of foreign domination firsthand. His upbringing, education in practical skills, exposure to local culture and legends, and early acts of defiance shaped him into a figure of extraordinary resilience and leadership. The young Wallace, who once navigated the trials of a small Scottish village, would soon emerge as the symbol of resistance against English tyranny, a man whose courage and vision would inspire generations of Scots. These formative years laid the essential groundwork for his legendary campaigns, setting the stage for a story of rebellion, sacrifice, and ultimately one of the most harrowing punishments in history. By the early 1290s, Scotland was teetering on the edge of chaos. The deaths of King Alexander III in 1286 and his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, had left the nation without a clear heir. This succession crisis plunged the country into political turmoil, making it vulnerable to external influence. In England, King Edward I, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, saw an opportunity to extend his dominion northward. Edward's intervention in Scottish affairs was ostensibly aimed at resolving the succession dispute, but his motives were far more insidious. He sought to bring Scotland under English control entirely. Edward demanded that Scottish nobles recognize him as their overlord in exchange for arbitration of the succession. Many Scottish magnates, faced with the threat of invasion and eager to secure their own positions, reluctantly complied. This decision, however, sowed the seeds of resentment among the common people and emerging nationalist leaders like William Wallace. While some nobles saw Edward's interference as a political necessity, W.A. Wallace viewed it as an affront to Scottish sovereignty, a direct threat to the freedom of his homeland. The seeds of rebellion were being sown not in distant battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of those who valued independence over compromise. The political tension was compounded by economic pressures. Edward imposed heavy taxes to fund his campaigns, and Scottish peasants were forced to bear the brunt of these burdens. English administrators, often arrogant and dismissive of local customs, enforced the Crown's edicts with little regard for fairness. Lands were confiscated, rents increased, and local leaders who resisted were punished harshly. For the rural population, daily life became a struggle for survival, and every injustice deepened the growing sense of resentment. Wallace, who had already been shaped by a strong sense of justice and loyalty to his fellow Scots, could not ignore these abuses. It was not only the common people who suffered under Edward's overreach. Many Scottish nobles were caught between the threat of English retaliation and their loyalty to the Scottish crown. Alliances shifted constantly as lords sought to protect their estates and retain influence. The resulting instability created fertile ground for a charismatic and determined leader to emerge, someone capable of uniting disparate factions and inspiring resistance. Wallace, with his combination of courage, intelligence, and unwavering moral conviction, was uniquely positioned to fill this role. Local uprisings began to break out in various regions, often small in scale but significant in their symbolism. Attacks on English garrisons, ambushes of tax collectors, and acts of defiance by villagers signaled that unrest was spreading. These skirmishes were usually led by local leaders, many of whom were motivated by personal grievances rather than a cohesive nationalist ideology. Wallace, however, would soon transform this scattered resistance into a more organized and strategically effective campaign. His understanding of the terrain, knowledge of guerrilla tactics, and ability to inspire loyalty made him a natural figurehead for the growing movement. One particularly volatile area was the borderlands between Scotland and England. These regions had long been contested, with shifting allegiances and frequent raids. Families on both sides of the border were intimately familiar with the costs of war, and the population was hardened by generations of conflict. Wallace, hailing from Renfrewshire in the west, was acutely aware of the vulnerabilities of these regions. His early experiences navigating the political and physical landscape of the borderlands provided him with invaluable insights into strategy, logistics, and the psychology of resistance. By the mid-1290s, the English crown had begun to tighten its grip on Scotland. Edward demanded military support from Scottish lords, expecting them to contribute men and resources to his campaigns abroad. Those who refused faced severe consequences, including the seizure of lands and imprisonment. The heavy-handed tactics of Edward's officials inflamed public sentiment and created martyrs whose suffering became rallying points for rebellion. Wallace, deeply attuned to the injustices suffered by his countrymen, recognized that the time for action was approaching. Religious institutions also played a role in the rising tensions. Monasteries and churches were centers of both spiritual guidance and political influence, and many clergy were sympathetic to the Scottish cause. English interference in church matters, coupled with the economic exploitation of church lands, further alienated the population. Wallace understood the importance of winning the support of these influential institutions, not only for moral legitimacy, but also for the practical advantages they could provide in terms of intelligence, resources, and shelter for rebels. The cultural dimension of resistance should not be overlooked. Scotland had a rich tradition of storytelling, song, and oral history, which preserved memories of past heroes and victories. These narratives reinforced a sense of identity and continuity in the face of foreign domination. Wallace, growing up amidst these stories, internalized the ideals of bravery, honor, and loyalty to one's homeland. He was not merely reacting to immediate oppression, he was inspired by a centuries-long tradition of Scottish resilience. His rebellion, when it began, would be framed not as a personal vendetta, but as a continuation of a national struggle. Another critical factor in the escalating tensions was the role of betrayal and mistrust among the Scottish elite. Some nobles were willing to collaborate with Edward to protect their own interests, undermining unity and fostering resentment among those committed to independence. Wallace's emerging leadership would later be defined by his ability to transcend these divisions, appealing to shared values and a common purpose rather than narrow self-interest. His rise highlighted the growing divide between those willing to compromise and those unwilling to accept foreign domination under any circumstances. In summary, by the late 1290s, Scotland was a nation on the brink. Political instability, economic exploitation, social unrest, and cultural pressure combined to create a volatile environment. The English crown's relentless pursuit of dominance, paired with the moral and physical injustices imposed on ordinary Scots, set the stage for rebellion. Local uprisings were increasing in frequency, and the population was ready for a figure who could channel their anger into organized resistance. William Wallace, wit. His unique combination of personal courage, strategic insight, and moral authority was emerging as that figure. His early experiences had prepared him for leadership, and the growing unrest provided the perfect opportunity to challenge English rule directly. These years of rising tension were crucial in shaping the rebellion that would follow. They reveal not only the external pressures imposed by a foreign power, but also the internal dynamics that made organized resistance possible. Wallace's understanding of both allowed him to position himself at the center of the struggle, ready to ignite a movement that would capture the imagination of Scotland and, ultimately, the world. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the coming years would see Wallace rise from a determined young man to a legendary symbol of freedom, culminating in a confrontation with the full might of the English crown and eventually the horrific punishment that would make his name immortal by the late 1290s. Scotland was simmering with unrest, and William Wallace was emerging from the shadows as a figure destined to channel that discontent into open rebellion. His early life had prepared him for leadership, and the escalating tensions under King Edward I's oppressive rule created the perfect storm. While scattered uprisings and localized resistance had already begun across Scotland, it would take a combination of audacity, strategic genius, and charisma to transform these minor skirmishes into a movement capable of challenging England's military might. Wallace would become that catalyst, and his first victories would ignite a fire that no force could easily extinguish. The story of Wallace's rise begins in a small act of personal vengeance that would quickly escalate into a wider campaign of resistance. According to later chronicles, Wallace's first notable act occurred when English soldiers murdered his wife, or in some accounts, a close female relative, prompting him to retaliate. This incident, though often romanticized, served as the immediate spark for his rebellion. Wallace's response was swift and brutal. He hunted down the English perpetrators and exacted retribution. While the details are difficult to verify, the narrative underscores a crucial point. Wallace's motivations were rooted in a profound sense of justice and loyalty, qualities that would define his leadership. His personal grievance became the lens through which the broader injustices of English rule were confronted. Following this initial act, Wallace began to organize bands of men to resist English control more systematically. These early forces were composed largely of local peasants, disenfranchised nobles, and border warriors familiar with the terrain and guerrilla tactics. Unlike conventional armies, which relied on rigid formations and formal discipline, Wallace's S-forces excelled at mobility, surprise attacks, and exploiting knowledge of the landscape. Forests, hills, and rivers became strategic assets rather than obstacles. By leveraging these advantages, Wallace was able to strike quickly, inflict damage, and vanish before English reinforcements could respond. This approach not only conserved limited resources, but also built a reputation for unpredictability and cunning. One of Wallace's earliest major victories came at the Battle of Lanark in 1297. Although not a large-scale engagement by modern standards, the battle had immense symbolic significance. Wallace and his followers attacked the English garrison, successfully overrunning it and freeing prisoners. The victory demonstrated that Edward I's forces, though formidable, were not invincible, and it emboldened other Scots to join the resistance. The triumph at Lanark also established Wallace's reputation as a capable military leader, able to inspire loyalty and coordinate effective operations despite the limitations of his modestly equipped forces. The victory at Lanark was quickly followed by a series of strategic raids and skirmishes across southern Scotland. Wallace's approach was not to engage in prolonged sieges or conventional warfare, but to target key English outposts, disrupt supply lines, and weaken enemy morale. These tactics reflected both his understanding of asymmetrical warfare and his keen psychological insight. By demonstrating that the English could be defeated, even in minor encounters, Wallace instilled hope in a population that had endured years of subjugation and humiliation. The crowning achievement of Wallace's early campaign came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, also in 1297. Unlike previous engagements, Stirling represented a large-scale confrontation with English forces and showcased Wallace's strategic brilliance. The English army, confident in its numerical superiority, attempted to cross the narrow bridge over the River Forth, underestimating Wallace's ability to exploit terrain and timing. Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Moray, positioned their forces strategically on the opposite side, allowing the English to begin the crossing before launching a devastating counterattack. The narrowness of the bridge prevented the English from bringing their full strength to bear, and Wallace's forces overwhelmed them, killing thousands while sustaining relatively few losses themselves. The victory at Stirling Bridge was a turning point. It was not merely a tactical success, it was a psychological triumph that sent shockwaves through both Scotland and England. For the Scottish people, the battle proved that liberation was possible. For the English crown, it was a stark reminder that rebellion, once ignited, could not easily be extinguished. Wallace's fame spread rapidly, and he became a symbol of Scottish resistance, earning the respect of allies and the fear of adversaries alike. Following Stirling, Wallace continued to consolidate his influence, moving through Scotland to rally support and organize defenses. He recognized that victories on the battlefield were only part of the struggle. Securing loyalty among local leaders, building alliances, and maintaining the morale of his forces were equally essential. Wallace's leadership style combined courage, charisma, and moral authority. He treated his followers with respect and instilled in them a sense of purpose beyond mere revenge or self-interest. This approach strengthened cohesion and ensured that his growing army remained committed to the cause even in the face of overwhelming odds. Wallace's early victories also had significant political implications. The Scottish nobility, divided and hesitant, began to view him as a central figure around whom resistance could coalesce. Some nobles, initially wary of his peasant-led forces, recognized that Wallace's successes offered a path to a united front against Edward I. His ability to transcend social hierarchies and appeal to shared national identity was a key factor in the durability of his campaign. Unlike other leaders who relied on traditional authority, Wallace drew legitimacy from his achievements and his unwavering commitment to the Scottish cause. It is important to note that Wallace's rise was not without controversy or challenge. Some nobles remained suspicious of his motives, and his reliance on unconventional warfare sometimes drew criticism. Moreover, the English crown intensified efforts to suppress the rebellion, sending increasingly larger and better-equipped forces into Scotland. Wallace faced constant pressure, knowing that each victory could provoke an even harsher response. Yet his early successes reinforced his determination and validated his strategies. Each triumph at Lanark, Stirling Bridge, and other engagements demonstrated that courage, ingenuity, and unity could challenge even the most powerful armies of the age. By the end of this period, Wallace had transitioned from a local rebel motivated by personal grievances to a national leader capable of inspiring widespread resistance. His victories were more than military successes. They were a statement of possibility, a signal to Scots that freedom was achievable through determination and collective action. These early campaigns laid the groundwork for further confrontations with English forces and cemented Wallace's status as a symbol of defiance. His exploits captured the imagination of contemporaries and chroniclers alike, ensuring that his name would endure in both history and legend. In retrospect, The significance of Wallace's first major victories extends beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. They marked the emergence of a national consciousness, a collective Scottish identity forged in opposition to oppression. Wallace demonstrated that leadership could be defined by principles as much as by lineage or wealth, and that strategic brilliance, courage, and moral clarity could alter the course of history. The victories set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to Wallace's capture and brutal punishment, ensuring that his struggle and his story would be remembered for centuries. Following his early victories at Lanark and Stirling Bridge, William Wallace had transformed from a local rebel into a figure of national significance. By 1297 and the years that followed, his reputation as a fearless strategist and symbol of Scottish resistance spread rapidly, inspiring hope among the oppressed and fear in the hearts of English rulers. But Wallace's rise was not solely the result of battlefield success. It was a combination of military brilliance, political acumen, and moral authority that established him as the true leader of Scotland's fight for independence. Wallace's leadership emerged during a period of profound political fragmentation. The Scottish nobility, already divided over loyalties to Edward I or the Scottish crown, struggled to form a unified response to the English threat. Some lords sought compromise, negotiating temporary truces with the English to preserve their estates, while others openly collaborated with Edward, undermining collective resistance. Amid this fractured political landscape, Wallace's appeal transcended traditional class boundaries. Unlike most nobles, he drew support from peasants, minor landowners, and disaffected knights, uniting disparate groups under a common cause, the defense of Scottish freedom. One of the hallmarks of Wallace's leadership was his ability to instill a sense of purpose and moral clarity in his followers. Unlike mercenary forces motivated solely by payment or loyalty to a lord, Wallace's army fought for a larger ideal. His troops understood that their struggle was not merely a personal vendetta, but part of a broader fight for justice and sovereignty. Wallace's charisma, integrity, and unwavering commitment to the cause inspired extraordinary loyalty. Chroniclers note that his presence on the battlefield could galvanize men who had previously been fearful or uncertain, transforming them into a disciplined and cohesive force capable of taking on far larger English armies. Wallace's military genius was evident not only in his tactical victories, but also in his strategic foresight. He understood that open field battles were risky when facing the numerically superior English forces, and so he relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and the careful use of terrain to neutralize the enemy's advantages. His campaigns emphasized speed, surprise, and psychological impact. By attacking supply lines, targeting English garrisons, and striking unexpectedly, Wallace destabilized the occupying forces and forced them to operate under constant stress and uncertainty. This approach allowed a relatively small force to punch far above its weight, gaining both victories and the confidence of the Scottish population. Political maneuvering was another critical aspect of Wallace's rise. He recognized the importance of legitimacy and sought to present himself not merely as a rebel, but as a protector of Scotland's national interest. In 1297, Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland, a title that reflected his role in leading the nation in the absence of a monarch. While the appointment did not confer the traditional powers of kingship, it was a symbolic acknowledgement of his authority and the trust placed in him by both the populace and sympathetic nobles. As Guardian, Wallace was responsible for organizing resistance, coordinating campaigns, and maintaining the fragile unity among Scotland's leaders. Wallace's administrative skills became increasingly important as his campaigns expanded. Beyond leading troops into battle, he oversaw the collection of resources, the organization of intelligence networks, and the distribution of supplies. Maintaining an army in the field required not only courage, but also logistical ingenuity, particularly in a nation disrupted by war and occupation. Wallace's ability to balance military operations with practical administration helped sustain his forces over extended campaigns, ensuring that victories could be consolidated rather than fleeting. One of Wallace's most notable achievements during this period was his ability to inspire widespread popular support. Ordinary Scots, previously passive under English rule, began to see in Wallace a figure capable of defending their homes, families, and way of life. His victories were celebrated in songs, stories, and oral traditions, spreading his fame even to areas where he had never personally led forces. This popular backing was crucial, providing recruits, shelter, and supplies, and reinforcing the notion that Wallace's struggle represented the collective will of the Scottish people. Wallace also understood the symbolic power of national identity. He emphasized Scottish independence not merely as a political or military objective, but as a moral imperative. In speeches, proclamations, and interactions with his followers, he framed the conflict as a defense of Scotland's sovereignty and dignity against an oppressive foreign ruler. By appealing to shared values, history, and a sense of cultural pride, Wallace strengthened the cohesion of his forces and created a narrative that extended beyond immediate battles. This framing helped unify a population divided by class, geography, and previous loyalties. Despite his growing authority, Wallace's rise was not without challenges. Some Scottish nobles remained skeptical of his unconventional background and peasant-led army, questioning his legitimacy and motives. Others resented his growing influence, fearing that a charismatic leader from outside the traditional power structure might overshadow their own authority. Wallace navigated these challenges with a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and demonstration of military capability. By proving himself repeatedly in battle and showing fairness in leadership, he gradually won over many who had initially doubted him. The English response to Wallace's leadership further underscores his impact. Edward I, already wary of Scottish resistance, dispatched increasingly larger and better-equipped forces to crush the rebellion. Despite this, Wallace's army continued to win able victories, demonstrating both tactical ingenuity and resilience. The English crown came to view Wallace not merely as a nuisance, but as a significant threat to their authority in Scotland. His rise forced Edward to reconsider his strategies and commit resources that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere, highlighting the broader geopolitical implications of Wallace's leadership. Wallace's prominence also brought personal sacrifices. Leading a rebellion meant constant danger, the weight of responsibility for the lives of thousands, and exposure to betrayal. Wallace was acutely aware that any defeat could not only reverse his gains, but also endanger the very people he sought to protect. Yet he persevered, motivated by a deep sense of duty and conviction. His personal courage, combined with his ability to inspire others, reinforced the legitimacy of his authority and sustained the momentum of the Scottish cause. By the peak of his leadership, Wallace had become more than a military commander. He was a national symbol. His victories, moral authority, and unwavering commitment to Scottish independence created a legacy that would resonate for centuries. He had transformed scattered uprisings into a coherent national movement, demonstrating that leadership required vision as much as valor. Wallace's rise was a testament to the power of individual agency in shaping history, illustrating how determination, strategy, and moral clarity could challenge even the most formidable oppressors. In conclusion, the period of Wallace's rise as a patriot leader was marked by a combination of military brilliance, political acumen, and moral authority. He united a fragmented nation, inspired ordinary citizens, and repeatedly defeated superior forces through strategy, courage, and innovative tactics. His leadership extended beyond the battlefield, encompassing diplomacy, administration, and the cultivation of national identity. By consolidating his influence, Wallace set the stage for the climactic confrontations with Edward I's forces and established the legacy that would make his eventual capture and brutal punishment a story remembered throughout history. The rise of Wallace demonstrates that true leadership is forged not merely through power or wealth, but through vision, integrity, and the ability to inspire collective action in the pursuit of justice. After years of inspiring Scottish resistance and achieving remarkable victories, William Wallace's journey as a national hero was approaching its tragic climax. His rise as a military leader and symbol of Scottish independence had made him a target of relentless pursuit by the English crown. King Edward I, incensed by Wallace's victories and the threat they posed to his authority, was determined to capture the rebel leader by any means necessary. Despite Wallace's brilliance on the battlefield and his skill in evading capture, a combination of betrayal, political intrigue, and the sheer persistence of the English eventually led to his downfall. Wallace's success had made him both respected and feared, but it also attracted enemies within Scotland. While many Scots admired his courage and leadership, some nobles viewed him as a threat to their own power and influence. These nobles, often prioritizing personal safety and their estates over national loyalty, were willing to collaborate with the English. Wallace's reliance on popular support and the loyalty of commoners meant that he lacked the backing of all segments of the Scottish elite, leaving him vulnerable to betrayal. This internal division would prove to be a critical factor in his eventual capture. The events leading directly to Wallace's fall are shrouded in both history and legend, but chroniclers agree on the involvement of Tray. Achary. In 1305, Wallace was betrayed by a Scottish knight named John de Menteith. De Menteith, acting either out of self-interest, fear, or loyalty to Edward I, provided the English with information about Wallace's whereabouts. At this point, Wallace was not commanding a large army, but was instead leading smaller operations, continuing to organize resistance and inspire the Scottish people. His reduced mobility made him more vulnerable to ambush and capture. Wallace was apprehended near Glasgow in the town of Rebroyston. According to accounts, he was traveling in disguise and attempting to move discreetly when English forces, informed of his location by de Menteith, surrounded him. Despite his renowned physical strength and combat skills, Wallace was caught off guard and unable to escape. The capture marked the end of his active campaign for Scottish independence, but it also set the stage for one of the most notorious events in medieval history, his brutal and symbolic punishment by the English crown. The English King Edward I viewed Wallace not merely as a captured enemy, but as a political symbol whose execution needed to serve as a warning to all who might resist English authority. Edward demanded that Wallace be publicly humiliated and executed in a manner that would convey the consequences of rebellion. This decision reflected both the personal animosity Edward felt toward Wallace and the broader strategic goal of quelling Scottish resistance through terror. Wallace, the man who had struck fear into the hearts of English soldiers and inspired an entire nation, would be made an example of in the most severe way imaginable. Wallace was transported to London, where he would face trial for treason against the English crown, a charge deeply ironic given that he had never recognized Edward as the legitimate ruler of Scotland. The trial itself was a farce by modern standards. Wallace was denied due process, representation, or the ability to mount a meaningful defense. The proceedings were designed to legitimize the crown's predetermined outcome rather than seek justice. Historians note that the trial was as much a theatrical demonstration of power as it was a legal process, intended to break the spirit of the Scottish people and reinforce Edward's authority. The sentence handed down to Wallace was horrific, even by the brutal standards of medieval justice. He was condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, one of the most severe punishments in England at the time, reserved for those considered the most dangerous enemies of the crown. The method was deliberately designed to inflict maximum suffering and public humiliation. Wallace was first subjected to a partial hanging intended to bring him to the brink of death without ending his life immediately. He was then disemboweled, with his internal organs removed in a procedure meant to symbolize both physical and moral defeat. His head was severed from his body and displayed in London as a warning to all would-be rebels. The remaining quarters of his body were sent to various cities in England, each piece exhibited to instill fear and assert Edward's dominance. Wallace's execution was more than a punishment, it was a statement of power, fear, and political theatre. Edward I sought to erase Wallace's influence, yet paradoxically, the severity of the punishment only immortalized him. Tales of Wallace's courage in the face of death spread across Scotland and beyond, turning him from a mortal leader into a symbol of resistance and martyrdom. His refusal to submit or plead for mercy elevated his status among his countrymen, who saw in his suffering the ultimate testament to loyalty, bravery, and the desire for freedom. The betrayal by John de Menteith has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue that de Menteith acted out of fear or pragmatism, believing resistance to be futile and hoping to secure his own position under Edward's rule. Others view the betrayal as a calculated political move, intended to curry favour with the English crown. Regardless of the motivation, the act of betrayal highlights the complex and dangerous political landscape in which Wallace operated. Leadership in a divided nation required not only battlefield skill, but also vigilance against treachery from both enemies and supposed allies. Wallace's fall also underscores the limitations of even the most brilliant military minds when faced with overwhelming political and logistical forces. While his strategic victories had been extraordinary, the English crown's persistence, resources, and ability to exploit divisions within Scotland ultimately overcame his advantages. The capture serves as a sobering reminder that individual heroism, no matter how legendary, can be vulnerable to the confluence of political intrigue, betrayal, and sheer might. Despite the tragic end, Wallace's influence did not die with him. His martyrdom galvanized further resistance in Scotland, inspiring subsequent leaders like Robert the Bruce to continue the struggle for independence. The memory of Wallace's courage and the injustice of his death became central to the Scottish national identity, reinforcing the idea that freedom was worth fighting and dying for. The brutal methods of his execution, intended to humiliate and intimidate, instead elevated him to a status that transcended the immediate military and political context. Wallace became an enduring symbol of defiance, whose legacy would resonate for generations. In the final analysis, the fall of William Wallace was not merely a personal tragedy, but a pivotal moment in Scottish history. It represented the end of his direct campaigns, but the beginning of a legend that would shape national consciousness. Betrayed by allies, captured through cunning and persistence, and subjected to one of the harshest punishments imaginable, Wallace's story encapsulates the perilous nature of leadership in an era of brutal politics and warfare. His life and death exemplify the tension between courage and vulnerability, idealism and realpolitik, and the individual and the state. Ultimately, Wallace's fall serves as a dramatic prelude to his posthumous fame. The injustice of his capture and the cruelty of his punishment highlight both the ruthlessness of medieval power and the enduring human fascination with heroism, sacrifice, and resistance. The story of his betrayal and execution lays the foundation for understanding why his legacy continues to inspire, why his name remains synonymous with Scottish independence, and why his harsh punishment, intended to erase him from history, instead ensured that he would be remembered forever.